So hi, I'm Steve Hayes, and I'm here to host a really exciting conversation on symbolic thought and communication from people who are very active in this area on both sides of the conversation between evolution science and contextual behavioral science, which is the focus of the entire book that myself and David Sloan Wilson are editing. And so I would ask each of the participants just to introduce yourself and just a 1 minute or so, not a detailed description, but what you bring to the table, what's of importance, how it links to your career and work to be focused on this particular topic. And then I'll ask each team to summarize their chapters for the book, and we'll get right into the conversation. So in no particular order, maybe perhaps the Ghent team could introduce themselves.
Okay. My name is Dermot Barnes-Holmes, and I'm a professor of psychology here at Ghent University, Ghent University. We only moved here about 2 years ago, less than 2 years ago, having spent most of our careers, or my career, in Ireland, at those universities in Ireland. I spent most of my career working on relational frame theory from the point at which I read the first chapter, which was a preprint at the time written by Steve Hayes on relational frame theory. So practically all of my research activity, one way or another, being oriented around that theory as a behavior analytic, contextual behavioral science account of human language and cognition that is self-consciously post-Skinnerian, and attempts to deal with many of the limitations of earlier behavioral accounts. We are in Belgium now, in Ghent University, because we received a large grant to further the, I suppose, current standing of relational frame theory, and particularly its application in clinical settings. And that has involved working almost without a break, because the grant allows us to not have to teach or do any administration for 5 years, almost exclusively in relational frame theory, and connect it more clearly with clinical issues. But it is ultimately a theory of language and cognition, which should speak to an attempt in basic science terms to understand language and cognition from a behavioral and contextual behavioral point of view, but also as a theory that should have immediate applied significance. So that's why we're here in Ghent. And well, to the left and right of me, the other co-authors of the...
And if you could both introduce yourselves as well.
Okay, so I'm Yvonne Barnes-Holmes. I'm obviously married to Dermot Barnes-Holmes. I've spent all my career in relational frame theory. Early on, most of my work, including my PhD, was on the development of those patterns or skills of relational responding in young, typically developing children, and how they can be used to understand atypical development in populations with language deficits, etc. I'm also an acceptance and commitment therapist, and have engaged in ongoing clinical work and supervision. And really, I think the latter few years of my career have been less focused on development and more focused on the relationship between the basic concepts in relational frame theory and how they need to be enhanced or added to or improved in order to get us closer to a bottom-up behavioral or contextual behavioral science understanding of psychological problems across the board, and how that understanding can influence the way intervention or changing the clinical behavior actually happens.
Awesome.
And I'm Ciara McEnteggart, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at Ghent University, and I followed Yvonne and Dermot over to Ghent. So I originally did my PhD in Maynooth under Yvonne's supervision. And my primary interest at the time started as a clinical interest, but became more and more RFT focused. So I have the same aims here in Ghent as one in Dermot. So I don't really differ from that.
All right, I guess it's my turn.
Yes.
I'm Terence Deacon. I'm a professor of biological anthropology, cognitive science, and neuroscience at the University of California, Berkeley. I did my graduate work at Harvard. In fact, some of it can be traced to my work as a graduate student when I took a course from Noam Chomsky and Jerry Fodor on the philosophy of language, and realized that I had a probably diametrically opposed view. As a biologist and trained in neurology as well, I focused my PhD work in trying to identify the differences in human brain structure that distinguished us from other primates and made language possible. I can't say I solved that problem. Obviously, it was a very difficult problem. And as a result, what I was able to show was that there were no absolutely novel structures or connections that I could find in making comparison between human brains and non-human brains that had to do with language. And in fact, I think it's become more and more clear that what's happened is structures that have been around in primate brains since their beginnings have been re-recruited for their language functions. And they probably haven't lost their original functions either, but it's a totally novel recruitment process. And that became the focus of my interests and led to a book in 1997 called The Symbolic Species, where I tried to make sense of those findings, both neurologically, or I should say in three different contexts, neurologically, semiotically, and evolutionarily. Semiotically, I realized that if this was going to involve structures and functions that had pre-existed language and were recruited to this new function, I sort of had to understand communication and brain function prior to language, non-linguistic. I think one of the real challenges in the field is that we have been overly linguistic in our thinking. We're not realizing that the brain itself is not specifically linguistic, not specifically indexical or iconic in its communication, but it has its own sort of logic. So try to marry the logic of brain function and particularly developing brain function with what language is really has vexed me all along. My recent work has begun to change my original ideas. Originally, I thought that the idea of universal grammar was silly. It made no biological sense to me, which is what really set me off in my arguments with Noam Chomsky and others from that field. I've come to believe that there is such a thing as universal grammar. And my contribution to this conversation is to actually argue that it arises in its structure neither from nature nor from nurture, and that we've ignored a third source, which has to do with the constraints of reference using symbols, using ungrounded sign vehicles. And that has actually created some of the special features of language, but it's also played a significant role in what parts of the brain were recruited for language. So that's a long story, but that's where I come from.
Awesome. Those are great introductions. So perhaps, Terry, you have the floor. Maybe I can, Terence. Do you prefer to be called Terence or Terry?
Terry. My friends call me Terry. If you're, depends on whether you want to attack me or not.
Then I'll definitely call you Terry. Perhaps I could ask you to just continue in the way that you have and describe your chapter in just 5 minutes or so, just the basic arguments, and then we'll move over to the other team and then begin our conversation.
All right, in the chapter I wrote, there's very little about brains, although that's been much of my research, has been trying to understand what's different about human brains. That argument has been developed really through the 1990s and into the 21st century, and changed bits by bit, in which I've begun to recognize what kinds of changes make most difference. But the chapter I wrote is mostly focusing on this question that I just ended with, which is what's the nature of the commonalities across languages. Where do they come from? In the chapter, I make a couple of different claims. One is that we have to expand beyond our tendency to think that the only possible sources of structure are what you might call nature and nurture. That is, cultural conventions set up by virtue of communication, and aspects having to do with human psychology, human brain function, and so on, that evolved specifically for these purposes. Because in my research, I found it harder and harder to explain some of these commonalities from a neurological point of view. And I felt that in effect, they should be far more variable from a cultural point of view. I began to go back to ideas that actually also began my research, which have to do with semiotic theories. And in my book, The Symbolic Species, I argue that one of the things that we see in the development of symbolic communication is the ability to go beyond reference by correlation, indexicality, or by similarity. The insight that I think that this led to for me was that when you begin to look at children's acquisition of language, what you see is a year at least of time in which they become better and better at communicating with their caretakers and with others, using pointing, gestures, eye movements, and exchanges of a variety of kinds, in which they're learning all the constraints of iconic and indexical communication. That is, learning how to get joint attention working and so on. Now, many people have claimed that this is what made language possible. I actually think it's what constrains language. It's not necessarily a precursor. I think we can do it without specializations in these areas. And my interest in how chimpanzees have been trained to do language-like tasks, which I don't think they have a tremendous capacity for, but nevertheless show that it's not impossible with the right supports to get some aspects of symbolic communication going. But the argument I make in the paper is that grammar and syntax produce what a colleague of mine, Joanna Leonardi, and I have called the symbol ungrounding problem. That is, in order to use sign vehicles that don't carry clues to their reference, that is, don't have likenesses or correlations in any obvious sense to the reference, and in order to maintain the grounding to that reference, you have to put that grounding somewhere else. And that grounding, that is the linkage that brings a communication to reference, is oftentimes outside of language, iconic and indexical. That is contextual cues of various kinds. And the argument I make in that paper is that there are a series of those clues that are brought into language from pointing, gesture, eye movement, and recognition of common frames, as you might call it. Since I don't know the field that you've come from, I would treat these as basically iconic frames, as recognizing categories of interaction and classes of interaction that frame things. So my background from that would be to use something like Irving Goffman's notion of frame theory. But those are the iconic features, and then the indexical and pointing features are critical. My argument is that grammar and syntax are strongly constrained by iconic and indexical features. And the only way to put iconism and indexicality into a sign system in which there are no built-in intrinsic grounding features, no iconic and indexicality in the sounds that we make or the print that we have. The only way that they can be brought into it is in the relations between words, between sounds, the combinatorial relations. But the combinations, in order to respect iconic and indexical features, are highly constrained. And I have come to realize that a lot of those constraints are not rules or licensing sort of built into our psychology in some sort of automatic, inherited way, but in fact are constraints on communication themselves. We can only communicate symbolically with certain kinds of combinatorial constraints that come from the problem of maintaining reference. And so the argument I make ultimately is that grammar and syntax do have universal features, that they're the result of incorporating very strict iconic and indexical constraints into language combinatorial operations. So that's the argument I'm making, and it's a radical departure, I think, from both the sort of innate linguistics perspective that has rules and licensing and so on determining grammar and syntax, but it's also a departure from the idea that these rules are just social conventions. They come as a result of communicational constraint alone, of turn taking, of just features that show up by virtue of some sort of cultural agreement. And it's one of the reasons why I begin the paper by talking about convention and the recognition that convention itself is a semiotic process, that you have to construct it semiotically. And if you can't construct it from symbols, from arbitrary sign vehicles, it has to be constructed from icons and indices in various ways. So that's the core logic of the paper.
Awesome summary. Thank you for that. Could we turn now to the Ghent team and however you want to organize it among yourselves? Just 5 or 6 minutes on your chapter.
Okay, we've agreed that I will sort of function as the main spokesperson for the team, so that we don't appear to be sort of ganging up on Terry or launching into a cacophony of voices. So with that said, I'd like to thank Terry for a very useful summary of his paper. I found it very compelling, and there appears to me anyway to be considerable overlap between the position he's outlining and the position we're coming from in RFT, but from very clearly different historical or intellectual backgrounds. And the background we're coming from is, I suppose, clearly Skinnerian to begin with, or a behaviorist background. And that's why our chapter starts with the Skinner's first behavioral attempt to deal with human language. And as was widely recognized both inside and outside the disciplines, very much a failed attempt at that. 7. And I suppose it's the other extreme, or Skinner's always painted the other extreme of the nativist position that was espoused by Chomsky, that it was all learning and all operant conditioning and so on, and you could explain virtually everything in that way. So the chapter we wrote works through that very briefly, explains why it doesn't work, and even Skinner himself started to reach for other concepts which connected with generativity, which was very much lacking in the early text around volume behavior. But again, no behavioral technical account of what that was. However, then in the early 70s and into the 80s, Murray Sidman stumbled upon an effect which described as stimulus equivalence, and began to provide, if you like, a behavioral explanation for what we mean by symbolic relations. Up until this point, symbolic relations in behavioral psychology were simply synonymous with arbitrary relations. And I think that's close to what some of the things that Terry says in his chapter, where you have a relationship between two things that bear no physical resemblance. You can't relate them on along any form of dimension, just as you can't relate the sound of a word to its actual object. So up until that point, that's all that was required to define a relation as symbolic in behavioral psychology. What Murray and his colleagues did was to stumble upon or discover that you needed more than that that you could go a so-called symbolic or arbitrary relation had to be generative or emergent and bidirectional. And so, without going into the detail of how he worked through this, he found that even a very simple training protocol in which a participant was trained to match one arbitrary stimulus to another, if you then presented those two same stimuli, but in a reversed order, so going instead from A to B, from B to A, humans, including relatively young humans, up even down to around 18 months or thereabouts, could in principle demonstrate this effect, which simple effect referred to then as symmetry and then in RFT as mutual entailment. But across decades, literally decades of research, researchers have found in behavioral psychology that non-humans, even primates with many years of language training or so-called language training, fail to demonstrate this very simple effect. And behavioral psychology, of all the psychologies, should be the one that should clearly be able to do this. First of all, we had investment in it. A lot of behavioral psychology was based on the assumption that the processes that you find in non-humans will readily be observed in humans and should, maybe with no need to have an idea or a suggestion of separate types of processes. And also they should have the technical skills to produce these effects with relative ease because of their experience with working with non-humans. But even to this day, in even very recent reviews that I've read and articles that are literally impressed that I've reviewed for journals, there's still a failure to convincingly demonstrate even symmetry in any non-human species. And the ease with which humans show it is remarkable. And so in relation to in terms of relational frame theory has taken this core unit, what we might describe as symmetry or mutual entailment, and seen it or offered it as the basic unit of human language and cognition that we know of. It's clearly defined, it can be clearly observed and produced in experimental preparation, and you can readily determine that it's observable in this species, but not any others apart from humans. Now, in the original rendition, in the chapter we've written, we note that the original, in the original volume, seminal volume of Relational Frame Theory written in 2001, we didn't speculate a great deal about the evolutionary history that gave rise to relational frame theory. There's a little bit in there, but it's not far from the centerpiece. More recently, Steve Hayes and others have argued that one of the important things that gives rise to the ability to mutually entail in the way that humans do is the propensity towards cooperation in humans and cooperative acts, involving things similar to the argument that I think Terry is making around joint attention and social referencing, and the fact that humans engage in what you might describe as non-verbal cooperation. So even very young infants, before they've acquired any sophisticated form of language, will cooperate with caregivers in various ways by picking up toys when parents are picking up toys, but not pick a toy up and put it away when somebody else enters the room and points at the toy, and so on. So it's these embedded acts of cooperation that then serve to generate mutual entailment as a unit, because you can both focus on the same thing. You get a sort of non-verbal perspective taking, where if I'm looking at something and you're looking at it, I also know you're looking at it. So the ability for me to point at something and for you to point at something allows me to point at you pointing at something, and so on. So mutual entailment, almost as a non-verbal act, is built in to cooperation itself, which comes first. And then from that, those types of cooperative acts, the ability to mutually entail emerges, because if we can imagine the early humans, that if we can engage in that type of cooperation in prehistoric times, if you like, then all it takes is for the young humans to start, or humans to start to grunt at the same time they point, and then to emit sounds that are specific to the object they're pointing to, and then bidirectionality begins to fall out of that. So when I see the object and I hear the sound, I start to hear the sound when I see the object, and symmetry is built in a way that doesn't emerge readily in non-human species, because they're not engaged in this intensely cooperative act that humans are. So that's the basic outline to the theory. One thing I suppose I can say is that in general, when having just read our own chapter as well as the other chapters, clearly we have two very different disciplines full of jargon. And I struggle at times to follow exactly in places what Terry was saying, not because it's badly written, but because I'm unfamiliar with the terms. And I'm sure Terry probably looked at some of the terms we were using and saying, what do they exactly mean? And again, just lack of familiarity with the concepts. But from what I can see, there seems to be a broad agreement, as I was looking at it, that if you like, the truth lies somewhere between the two extremes of this sort of extreme nativist position on the one hand, which is all pre-programmed and genetically laid down grammar, and on the other hand, it's all really stuff that is just learned in a very traditional way through classical and operant conditioning. That something unique happened in the evolution of human species that allows us to engage in relational framing and create the structures, complex relational structures that we see as pivotal in more complex relational networks that we more closely associate with, say, grammar and syntax. But this is built out of the core unit, if you like, of mutual entailment in the first instance, which falls out of these intense cooperative acts that humans evolve in their species specifically, but you're not unique to them. But there's a unique cluster of things that come together that allow relational framing or language and cognition, if you like, as a form of symbolic communication, or form of symbolic communication to emerge in the human species. It appears to be largely unique. There may be some limited forms of it in other species, but the complexity and generativity and power of language and relational framing, if you like, it seems to be unique to the human species, and there's virtually no evidence in over 30 years since relational frame theory was put on the deck by Steve to indicate otherwise. At this point, no one has produced a really clever chimpanzee, even after living with it for decades, that can readily engage in complex relational framing activities that we routinely see in even 4 or 5-year-olds, as far as we're aware. So I think that's a summary of the chapter. The only thing I suppose I would add to that is that maybe there are different meta-theoretical driving forces between the game we're playing and maybe the game that I think Terry is playing. Relational frame theory is very much built out of an attempt to build a theory of human language cognition which has direct and immediate applied implications. You want it something you could use to remediate language deficits where you find them in educational contexts, to do clinical psychology more effectively, and impact on the language that therapists use to or in social settings and employment settings. So I think that's one of the reasons you see these very different language games being played in the 2 sets of papers. So I think it's important to bear that in mind in the conversation, that in RFT terms, there's an overlap there, but our truth criteria might be slightly different and our fundamental assumptions might be slightly different. There's an awful lot of overlap that I think would be.
Maybe that would be a place that we could start a conversation, because you could imagine differences in analytic purpose could be complementary, because there's a big range of things to deal with and you may want to focus on particular aspects, or they could be contradictory, that they could reflect deeper differences in terms of truth criteria, analytic assumptions, and things of that kind. And so maybe we could start at 35,000 feet and just ask, what do we expect of a theory of symbolic thought and communication? And perhaps a little bit of beginning to think about these two wings. Are these differences that we see already in the conversation, differences in emphasis that could be complementary? Or are they differences in assumptions that actually reflect deeper lack of overlap or incommensurability?
Well, let me respond a little bit, because I think in one sense we are dealing with two complementary aspects, and that mine is, you might say, it's the within symbol relationship, the semantic relationship, and the between symbol relationship. It might be a simple way to describe that distinction. So what I focus on in the paper, though not in my work in general necessarily, is the between symbol relationships, the things that are called grammar and syntax. And yet, in my book, The Symbolic Species, the title giving this away, it's all about what's unusual about symbols. And of course, I don't talk about this mutual entailment relationship. However, I am aware of another, you might say, tale of the same story, which goes by another name, which I suspect you're fully aware of, and I don't know enough of it to know the connections, called stimulus equivalence. Basically, it's the same kind of argument. That is a stimulus and its correlate, each sort of double entail. And one of the things that's happened in recent times is people have begun to look at stimulus equivalence in fMRI studies, for example. And it's looking as though it takes a tremendous amount of prefrontal activity to maintain it. That is, that's where it's originally driven. And of course, the argument I make in The Symbolic Species has to do with the significantly increased role of prefrontal cortex, both in general brain function, but I think also in language. That is, it's involved in particularly combinatorial kinds of tasks that involve multiple possible associations and figuring out how to sort of sort them. My favorite example has to do with studies that were done with animals that were trained to stare at a focal point, and then a light was flashed someplace peripherally, and the task was to move your eyes in exactly the opposite direction. Whereas normally the spontaneous tendency is to look towards the flash of light. It's very difficult to look in the opposite direction. And it turns out that prefrontal cortex, particularly what we call the frontal eye fields, are critical for this task. And that what you can do is to show that you can actually sort of cool a part of prefrontal cortex that blocks that ability in other species. Now, what this is about, in a sense, in this particular case, it's about holding attention to multiple sites and then shifting that attention appropriately depending on a particular demand. Part of my work was to show that the prefrontal cortex has a kind of map that has to do with what I call orienting space. And the way that I kind of worked this out was to look at its connections with an area in the midbrain called the superior colliculus, the deep superior colliculus, which is involved in orienting away from personal space. And it turns out that that's the map. I was very interested in the fact that the prefrontal cortex doesn't have a stimulus map, doesn't have a motor map, but every place else in the cerebral cortex is mapped. To find that there's an orienting map in the prefrontal cortex that actually plays a role in controlling and regulating the possible orientations that you could take towards a thing, helped me understand why prefrontal cortex is so much involved in combinatorial assessments of various kinds. And I think that's why it's involved in this stimulus equivalence effect. So I think the stimulus equivalence effect is, or however you want to talk about it, mutual entailment, is critical. I think it plays a significant role. I don't think it's necessarily what you might call the smoking gun that made it possible. I think that increasing our tendency towards stimulus equivalence has made it easier. And I think that a lot of the prefrontal enlargement is the result of incredible selection driving this process. Now, in terms of the therapeutic side of it, I also think that there's the complementary sort of what I call combinatorial side of the problem. I think particularly in the case of autism, one of the things that happens in early stages of detecting autism is that children are not focusing in on eye gaze or attention of other individuals, do not engage in these kinds of cooperative activities very well, and particularly have trouble with pointing and using pointing behavior and understanding pointing behavior. If that indexical constraint system that has to be learned in order to move towards the use of symbols in a combinatorial way, the way we do with sentences, then you would expect that autistic children would have a terrific difficulty in getting into this. And so what I see in these two approaches is a complementation in which one side of the approach is focusing on how easily we acquire the symbolic relations, that is the correspondence relations. But the correspondence relations being relatively uncued can be now brought together with these combinatorial relations. And damage in either of these capacities or inabilities of either of these capacities should make language acquisition difficult. But it should also be an avenue for talking about different kinds of difficulties and then therapies that could be used to sort of pull it forward. So what I'm saying is I see these as very complementary to each other. And I'll stop with that.
Oh, sorry. Yes, the study of stimulus equivalence, as we indicated, went back to the early work of Murray Sidman, who I think coined the phrase, yeah, and so on. And it has been the source of many studies. I think one of the first fMRI studies reported by a colleague of mine from a number of years ago, David Dickens, who did with colleagues in Liverpool on this, and showed that when people were solving equivalence problems or demonstrating equivalence, that the areas associated with language were more active during the equivalence responding than during a control task. And indeed, we published work using EEG and so on, showing that many of the patterns that you see in things like priming, the N400 waveform and so on, are seen when you train and test for equivalence relations in laboratory settings. So there is considerable evidence and mounting evidence that the, if you like, the areas of the cortex associated with symbolic relations in natural language are also involved when human beings are demonstrating equivalence relations in a scanner, or with when wired up to EEG recording equipment. I suppose one of the important distinctions that we're making now in RFT, though, is between mutual entailment and what we call combinatorial entailment. That maybe I think hitherto we brushed over, particularly the equivalence literature, that appears to be the case. And there is developmental evidence. I think one of Steve's early studies with Gene Lipkins in 1980. Correct me if I'm right, Steve, you probably know the study better than I do, that you see the emergence of mutual entailment before you see the emergence of combinatorial entailment in the developmental trajectory of, I think it was Charlie at the time. And I think we've seen broadly similar findings in studies conducted since then. So in terms of evolutionary history, it will be difficult to get evidence to concrete evidence that also emerged in that way. But certainly in terms of the developmental trajectory of the development of relational framing or equivalence relations, symmetry or mutual entailment appears to emerge if only a matter of months before you see combinatorial entailment. And so I think certainly my own work and the work the group are putting together now, we've made a bigger deal out of separating mutual entailment from combinatorial entailment. In our early work, we just defined a frame as mutual entailment, combinatorial entailment, transformation, and function. I think saw the frame as the fundamental unit, but now I think we're starting to emphasize mutual entailment as more the fundamental unit. But again, that doesn't mean I'm saying there's a difference here, but I think when we talk about stimulus equivalence, equivalence requires the three elements together. It requires that you combine two mutually entailed relations into a relation or a very small network that relates two mutually entailed relations into a combinatorial entailed relation. And I can see why that would certainly involve the prefrontal cortex and require, or at least drive, the development of the prefrontal cortex in evolution terms to really start to, I suppose, take full advantage of the ability to build increasingly complex combinatorial relations that give rise to increasingly complex forms of relations and relational networks or grammar and syntax. And that can only happen once you get neurophysiological structures that can handle that kind of complexity, and from reading your own things like the recursive properties of language and so on. But I think from maybe an evolutionary point of view, that mutual entailment gets you some way towards very basic symbolic relations and not much more, and you probably get trapped there without evolution and cooperation taking advantage of those. So, but again, a lot of that is speculation. Certainly, we put greater emphasis on separating symmetry from the combinatorial entailed relations that follow from it. But certainly, everything else you were saying there, the idea that children with autism have difficulty because they lack the shared eye gaze and the joint referencing or joint attention and social referencing, or they have deficits in those areas that render language deficits almost a certain outcome or a certain consequence. I don't know. Do we answer Steve's question?
Let me restate it, because I think we're getting closer to it. But what do we expect of our theories? Like, let's take the case of autism. The idea that stimulus equivalence is an example of relating, and that we're evolutionarily prepared to do it. It still requires training within the history of the individual, and that. So some of these accounts suggest how that training should go. Of course, it may not be a neurobiologically intact organism. You never know when you're dealing with special populations, and you have to. But still, I think it would be thought, at least in normal populations, but even special populations, over on the behavioral analytics side, if you can't take the theory and walk people through it, if you can't remediate it, then there's something wrong with the theory. It could be that there's other things like structural problems and things of that kind. And I'm wondering, is that a complementary assumption? Because in mainstream language accounts, very often it looks as though the purpose is understanding whether or not you're able to do something with it. And so could we just focus on that one aspect? You emphasized it even in the very beginning of talking how you're trying to link it to application. And that shift of thinking of this as learned associations instead of its learned patterns of relating has led to a whole bunch of things that applied people can do on the RFT side. And do we expect that? Like, Terry, do you expect that of your own theory, that what you just said, what's in your chapter? If we could take that and, let's say, take an autistic child where you see some deficits there in the things that you're pointing to and build a training program, would it bother you if it didn't lead to the outcomes that you were hoping for? Or would it encourage you if it did? What is the role of this issue of being able to use the principles to change things.
So I think there are two aspects of this to focus on. One is that I think there's no question that in autistic children, there's some neurological issues that we don't understand. And just as with trying to work with adult aphasia patients after stroke, there's some things you just cannot bypass. You can get better. You can shift to secondary functional systems that can carry some of the load, but usually you can't go all the way. And my guess is that's the case with autism as well, that there's some limitations to it. I often think that the complement to autism is Williams syndrome, where you see a lot of language features well established, and stimulus equivalence turns out, it looks like, I think is well established in these people, but a lot of other cognitive capacities are really impaired. So I actually like to look at the two of them, but let me carry this to that next step of your question, which is what would this point to? I've recently come across a TED Talk of all things. I don't tend to be an aficionado of that stuff. I don't follow it much, and I've actually resisted doing it myself. But there was a young Indian man who came up, because he had an autistic family member, who came up with a sort of a picture logic system to help them communicate linguistically. I can't remember his name, the details, perhaps one of, or many of you know of this work. But it's basically something that you can put on your cell phone that has icons and relationships to these icons that you can build. And the icons are pictures of things. So that stimulus equivalence would be quite relevant for these. And the relations are indexical relations. And I was very much impressed by the fact that what was happening is that this technique, which is, I can't even remember the name of it, but I'd be glad to find it and dig it out and send it to you if it's unfamiliar, actually demonstrates that both of these aspects are crucial. That both of these aspects seem to be a problem, and that if you supply them with these tricks that we can do on computers and cell phones, that autistic children can actually engage in things that look very linguistic in terms of what they're able to communicate. And that was very surprising to me. And it seemed to me that that's the kind of thing one would look for to help both of these arguments understand this particular disturbance of language. But I think in general, it's a useful way to think about language. One other thing that I'd be interested in focusing on in this respect has to do with recent work that's come out of Berkeley this last year by the Gallant Lab. It's a paper, first author Huth, H-U-T-H, in which they showed long segments of stories, and they tried to do a correlational analysis, very complex principal components analysis that tried to identify what areas of the cerebral cortex were preferentially active, associated with particular categories of speech. And they created an almost unbelievable map of the cerebral cortex with basically mosaicked with words. It shows that almost every area of the cerebral cortex plays a role in making these semantic associations. Very few areas of the cerebral cortex were not involved, and that includes areas that we only consider sensory or motor, for some extent, not language areas per se. And this widespread use of all kinds of cortical areas involved in what you might call the semantics of language also suggests that this is a really remarkable recruitment of the entire cerebral cortex in language, and that we're sort of, when we focus on these sort of local language areas, we're looking at only a small part of the picture. Each of these suggests a very different view of language than we have traditionally stepped into.
Does team opposite want to comment? a comment.
So first of all, I should ask if these two features I just described to these two studies are familiar to you folks. If they're not
the recent one, but I'm sort of aware of the idea that it's difficult. Some of the more recent evidence in neuroscience is indicating that it is becoming increasingly difficult to localize language things in certain areas and say this is responsible for semantics and this is responsible for
exactly, yeah.
And so the more sophisticated ways of looking at brain activity are beginning to make things look even more complicated or complex than they were. They're probably truly distributed throughout the cortex, and including language, and it's not some small new area that evolved through some genetic mutation, fairly recently in our history, and this is where language happens, and it doesn't happen anywhere else. But I must look that recent study up because I find it fascinating. If you've got,
I will be glad to send the text for it. There's actually a wonderful video. This was done by Nature, the journal Nature. Wonderful video of this process as well. It's quite remarkable. Colleagues of mine have done things that I wouldn't have thought possible to make it happen. So I think it's worth looking at. Also, I think, curiously, and I'll try to provide this information to you because I think it would aid our conversation in the future, of this study from India. This just a very young man who just sort of guessed at a way to help his autistic family members sort of.
Well, there have been pretty well worked out programs with autistic kids using pictograms. There's experimental evidence on both the strengths and weaknesses of that approach. But Dermot and team, did you want to?
I suppose that when we think about go back to the question about the extent to which your theory or your account should lead to not the promise of, but immediate evidence of, or relatively immediate evidence of some practical gain in one or more domains. I think the very units of analysis that we propose in relational frame theory are built around that need, or that absolute essential philosophical need for prediction and influence, remediation, improvement, and so on. That's not to say that you don't recognize there may be structural deficits and structural issues that cannot be resolved, but you start from the assumption that you have to come up with units of scientific analysis that specify the very variables that you need to manipulate to, in principle, remediate deficits or control for excesses or construct behaviors that don't yet exist or want to exist. So in the context of a relational frame theory, for instance, just to look at all often accounts, what are the variables you will work with? Well, we focus on in RFT what's a core explanation, the whole idea of exemplar training. You need to provide many, many exemplars of the units of analysis you're going after. So it could be mutual entailment, it could be combinatorial entailment, and you need to bring those under various forms of contextual control. So with mutual entailment, you want to be able to show that young children, teach them that they can relate to things as being the same, to things as being the opposite, to things as being different, to things as being above and below, to the left, to the right of, and do it across various settings and so forth, and do it to a level of fluidity or flexibility so that you can get the children to do it one way, then bring in a cue that says do it the other way, and they will do it the other way for you, and so on, and then build up to more complex relations under contextual control. So your very units of analysis must specify what you need to do, the variables you need to target to produce the behaviors you're defining as language or verbal. Now, whether or not they actually are really verbal in a linguistic sense is important, but perhaps not right in the center of the theory. But you want the remediation, you want the behaviors you're targeting with your theory when you treat them with your theory, to show improvements then in what would broadly be described as language and cognition. If you don't get that, relational frame theory is not a theory of language and cognition. It's a, who knows what it is, but it becomes then a theory of irrelevant behavioral effects. But if it doesn't have some sort of impact on language and cognition, if you don't see improvements in language ability as measured by standardized measures, as measured by IQ measures, as measured by just teachers in the classroom saying, this child improved dramatically when you brought your program in and applied it, or you don't see improvement in therapeutic impacts when somebody trained in a way of delivering therapy was trained in therapeutic discourse using relational frame theory. If you don't see those improvements, then your theory is not a theory of language and cognition. It's an abstract theory of something else, but not much use to you. And it's essential in the field of contextual behavioral science that your theories do that. They impact in a very immediate way, and ways that are shown not just through anecdote or claims, but demonstrated through systematic scientific analysis of what you've done has improved things above and beyond what's available. It's a tough test. It's the toughest test of all in one sense, because it's the one that says, go make a difference. And you have
this links to something that's kind of in this volume. If you read all the chapters, you'll see it, because here you have two approaches that are specifically not mentalistic. They're evolutionarily oriented in the broadest sense, both within the lifetime of the individuals and across lifetimes. And yet they haven't been really speaking to each other particularly. I'd be surprised, Terry, if relational frame theory, with even that phrase, was very familiar to you. Maybe it
quite unfamiliar, actually.
Exactly. And so here's this body of several hundred studies comporting very nicely with some of the basic work you're doing there, but the sort of the archipelago nature of these sort of unvisited islands, even within the same basic philosophical approach, is remarkable. One of the things, the reason David and I called it, a reintegration, is that if you back up early enough and you look at who are the mentors of the mentors of the mentors, that wasn't true. There's a deep connection. You could follow it just by the intellectual histories of the people involved, and yet this idea of using application as just a reflection of some of the ways that these different islands in the archipelago have moved. I was kind of aiming to a question there, but just maybe to back up and think about, why do you think that here you have accounts that they're not nativistic, they're not sort of simple-minded, they're not reductionistic, they're not mentalistic, and yet they've existed apart from each other, and you see it over and over again. As you read the book, you'll notice there. Why do you think that the evolutionarily oriented folks have not brought together? This is going on too long. I'll edit it out when you're doing the thing. But David, at some point, started getting concerned about the fact, for example, that there's really not a robust applied evolution science. There's a few efforts, but it's not robust. And asking himself, why is that? What do we expect of each other? Do we want to see that? So are there just general comments that you have just about the nature of the connection and disconnection in this area and what it might mean for us going forward, not just in this specific area, but as a group of colleagues who have some obvious overlaps philosophically and theoretically? Is that too vague a question?
Well, there's obviously some vague features, but let me just say that part of it does have to do with this disciplinary siloing that's gone on over the course of history. Very few people in psychology follow a lot of the recent developments in evo-devo, evolutionary theory. which have radically changed, so that people have, I think that one of the challenges is outside of evolutionary theory, which is an incredibly rapidly changing and still a very contentious area, talking about the different processes. There really is so much of a difference in the sort of simple-minded neo-Darwinian perspective and the current perspective that's really sort of driving a lot of interesting research that hasn't made it out of the discipline. And I would say the same thing is probably true from psychology moving back into evolutionary biology. My early efforts have always been to bring those together, but there's such huge areas of literature that one ultimately ends up specializing. The other feature is that in order to do something applied, you really need to have a fairly strong, medical is not the right word, but sort of biomedical understanding of substrates. And evolution is about how these substrates change and how they're different. But we actually only have the ability to use extrapolation to find that out. So all of my work in the evolution of the brain has been comparing brains and then comparing the developmental processes that produce those differences in different species. And then asking the question, so what could make that difference in humans? What developmental processes might be involved? That's indirect, very indirect. And as a result, it's hard to apply, particularly with respect to the nervous system. It's hard to actually go directly to say, okay, now I can use that for a therapeutic source. And I must say that, you know, my focus has not been therapeutic. My focus as an evolutionary biologist is to understand the process itself, to understand how brain development has produced brain differences in different species and how it might help explain us. And so I think that kind of, I wouldn't say necessary, but hard to avoid island-like effect that you refer to is difficult to overcome. And that's why conversations like this should not be just one-off. Yeah. They have to continue, and we have to find ways, I would say we have to force them, because it's hard to do it. We just don't have the time and the energy to not do it otherwise. Let me say one other thing that I wanted to add to this. Okay. And that is one of the areas that I think the perspective I presented might have, and I have no way but to guess at this, therapeutic relevance has to do with what was originally called by Noam and others the poverty of the stimulus argument about grammar and syntax. The poverty of the stimulus says that children just don't get the feedback they need to develop the rules, the generalities that are grammar and syntax. What I argue is that, in fact, children get a lot of correction, but it's not about grammar and syntax specifically, it's about reference. It's about failure or ambiguity of reference. And that's what all of early communication between parents and children, and about, you know, children communicating with other children as they get older. You know, you've got to get the reference clear. And my argument there is that that's usually fails because of this disconnection of what you might call the symbolic and the indexical aspects of language. I don't know what you're pointing to with those words, is sort of the way you might ask the reference question. And I think that's a relevant issue therapeutically, because it may well be that one needs to focus on that under certain circumstances and to know when that's the problem. So in part of my argument about autism, I think that may be a really crucial clue as to how to get towards the autistic side of things, because the indexical features are just simply not available to them. And you need to sort of drive and make those powerful. Now, it's an entire speculation. I have no therapeutic background to say that. But it's what I would say the predictions from this. The other set of predictions that I think fit both of our perspectives, and as I say, I think the perspectives are complementary, not competing, is what does this tell us about how we might have changed or might in the future change our attempts to teach symbolic communication to primates or to other species? Would we do it differently now that we know that they have a stimulus equivalence problem? That is, would we actually come up with a training that would amp that part of it up? Would we come up with a training that would help us drive the combinatorial relations and the indexical features? Could we actually show major differences? Now, this is not therapeutic, but it's a sort of correlation. You might say the complementary kind of study that one would do to get at the therapeutic efficacy of these approaches. I'll stop it.
Want to jump in?
Yeah. In fact, I mean, what Terry has just suggested there is there have been a number of studies, not that many, but an increasing number in the behavioral literature that have attempted just that using exemplar training. One of the papers I reviewed recently I think it was by Occhioli and Zentor, reviewed the literature on exactly that. It was a Mark Delizio piece where he reviewed the literature on exemplar training, or attempts to use exemplar training to generate derived relations in non-humans. And again, the results were largely negative. It just doesn't seem to work with non-human species, and which sits more readily, I think, with the idea that even mutual entailment, the simplest unit, is built or very much embedded in cooperative acts. So,
but there's a small number of studies looking at exemplar training with very young children. In fact, your team and Yvonne is involved in some of that earliest work, which I don't know if that's really nailed yet. But my takeaway from that seemed to be, if you didn't provide that kind of training to children, they weren't going to spontaneously do it. So the cooperative history evolutionarily may have given rise to the capacity, but within the lifetime of the children, they have. Do you think that's been settled? That basically you have to train symmetry as an operant in order to be able to get it. I'm going to say it that way.
I think the evidence indicates that. I think, but of course, it's the sort of thing where you need more studies, replicating, and so on. But it's not some you don't see symmetry or mutual entailment in very young children. It's something that emerges around 18 months at the earliest, and does seem to require, from what we can see, at least in relations other than equivalence, requires. And that's, I think, because it emerges slightly later. You need that history of exemplar training for particular types of frames, bringing it under contextual control to see robust evidence for it. So it's not there present from birth. It's something that requires a history of cooperation between species, and then you need exemplar training within this lifetime.
But there, some of the things that are in Terry's chapter seems to me are actually kind of in the things that are being done. Take things like the traditional Skinnerian operants. They include a fair amount of these kind of indexical relations that are directly trained. And for example, if you take the recent evidence with Mark Dixon's protocol, where he starts training these higher order derived relations, but only after he trains a robust ability to respond more in these non-arbitrary ways that sort of form a foundation for it. In other words, I think this complementary nature of it might actually be farther along than it looks, just the way we're speaking, because even as I sit here, I can think of several studies that would map onto what Terry's talking about and onto what you're talking about in your chapter in a pretty close way experimentally, to seem to show that, yes, you have to train this and get that well established, and not just in autistic kids and things like that, where you may have an underlying neurobiological deficits, but just in the normally developing child and how they learn.
Can I just add something?
Yeah,
I think
definitely.
One thing that we have seen, and there's a student of mine in Poland, Christina Pomorska's PhD is on this, that I think you can't separate exemplar training from context. and I think context, I think, accounts for the contextual detail accounts for a lot of our success in this training, and I think connects to what Terry's saying. So it isn't just about dropping down exemplar training with the right stimuli, because the stimuli become impoverished in the wrong context. So we have children, for example, typical and atypical, particularly atypicals, who can do entailment in one context and clearly cannot do it in another. So they can do it with one frame but can't do it. So you see these really highly controlling contextual features. So I think we used to talk about exemplar training, I think, in a way that wasn't sensitive enough to context. And now we're seeing just how embedded that natural learning is, and how richly embedded and inherently generalized the new training has to be. Because, I mean, before it would have been odd to say, well, you'd have just said, well, they've cracked mutual entailment, they can probably do it across the board. No, Pomorska's evidence is very, very clear. It gives you a foot up, but it doesn't mean that once you've done mutual in one frame, you're going to be able to get it in another. There's not as much momentum in the system as we thought there was. It's much more contextually dependent, even for typically developing children, and very much so. In fact, for the atypically developing children in her research, it's almost idiosyncratic. The connections with context are almost idiosyncratic. So you've got to do this very detailed analysis of mutual and combinatorial in particular frames, in particular contexts. And then based on that analysis, you then have to create interventions accordingly. So I think what Terry's stuff does is alludes to context. There are many of those features that we have now started to really adopt in the sort of post-exemplar training era of training relational repertoires with young children.
Well, if you follow that out, it seems possible that the behavioral community, because of its history of focusing on prediction and influence and dialing into the details of it, can almost come into a partnership with some of the things that Terry and his colleagues are pointing to as kind of an experimental and extended arm, not just in application, but in testing these things in experimental analysis, and then being able to look at the underlying, at the effects that they have on the repertoire, and including the neurobiological effects, because the brain is a plastic organ and it's responding to this kind of training as well. You were going to say something, Terry.
Yeah, I was going to add a couple of things. Number one, what we haven't talked about in terms of acquisition is the fact that different parts of the cerebral cortex and other parts of the brain are maturing at different rates. And one of the very last regions to fully mature is prefrontal cortex. I think one of the reasons that stimulus equivalence or mutual entailment kinds of processes are very late to show up in comparison have to do, I think, with the fact that I think prefrontal cortex is very immature. One of my earliest studies as a graduate student was to look at the sort of the standard Piagetian tasks in terms of prefrontal maturation, and to recognize that what we're actually seeing in the early sensory motor tasks was actually the capacity to begin to do what we call transfer learning, to take a learning in one context and shift it to a new context by relational features as opposed to stimulus features. And of course, stimulus equivalence, or whatever you want to call it, is a relational feature. It's not just a stimulus feature. And that turns out to be something that's also across species, very, very poorly developed, even in primates like chimpanzees and gorillas. Old work by Duane Rumbaugh was able to show that they have very, very poor transfer learning abilities, but that there is some increment as we move to species like primates from species, like monkeys. And so, I mean, from monkeys to apes, for example, there seems to be an advantage. And of course, children do it by 2 years of age. Children are great at this. They do transfer learning without difficulty. But again, they don't do it at a year of age. Any more than they do the stimulus equivalent stuff easily at a year of age. So I think that one of the factors that we have to consider always also when we talk about development is it's not just experience. It's experience and then having a system capable of using that experience to do something, to acquire something. And that seems to be a really crucial issue.
We're coming up on the end of our time, but my clock just 4 minutes, and as I expected, we stole our additional time. That's happened with every team so far because people get excited and having fun, and the clock becomes less important. But perhaps there's time just for literally a 1 minute kind of concluding comment of what you saw just in the conversation and what you might hope for going forward.
Can I preface it by saying that one major difference between what we're talking about here is that the piece I wrote is speculative in the sense that it's a theoretical argument. It's an argument not based upon volumes of research that I've done in a laboratory or even in my neuroscience work. This is outside of my own neuroscience and developmental work. It's an attempt to answer a question that was raised maybe 2 generations ago now that I think about it. And I think has been inappropriately answered because we had a limited perspective. It's only nature or nurture that could have done it, or some combination of the two. My point in this paper is to say, no, we've got to open our eyes. There's more options here. So part of what I want to do, it's in some sense almost a reaction to my own neurological focus, is to say, no, it's not just a neurological problem. It's not just a cultural problem. It's not just an evolutionary problem. It's bigger than that. It's neither nature nor nurture. There's a whole other realm we haven't paid attention to.
Awesome. And the Ghent team,
Yep, I think I think I would echo Terry's sentiments there in his last statement that, in a general sense, having read his chapter, you can see that there seems to be almost a coming together of research in that tradition and research and conclusions in the behavioral tradition, the behavioral science tradition, in that thinking in terms of one or the other extreme is not the way to go. I think it's all nature, it's all nurture, or it's all behaviorism is all tabula rasa, and it's the opposite from the tradition, very traditional Chomskyan linguistic tradition. That blinds you to all sorts of possibilities that are available if you think in this more holistic way and say, okay, what if we just put those assumptions aside and work from bottom up and deal with questions without having to align yourself with one particular perspective, if you like, and say, well, I'm going to hold on to my nurture perspective or my nature perspective. And I think that led to some talking past each other in the history of the disciplines trying to deal with language in a way that wasn't necessarily good for any of us. But I think what we're seeing here, and I certainly saw so many things I had, I mean, literally in front of me, all I can see all over the manuscript from Terry is I'm writing, yes, RFT consistent, yes, makes sense to me. Oh, that's very useful. Oh, I didn't know that. That's excellent. That would be, I'll use that in my lectures on RFT. So, you know, I don't think there's any one big no in there that I've written where I say I fundamentally disagree. So I think that this has been a very useful exercise in that respect.
Well, and I think that's true in the whole volume. I think you're going to see a remarkable amount of overlap, and not just me too, but an opportunity in some differences to build and support each other and move the ball down the field. And that is the end of our time. Terry, did you want to? Oh,
so one of the questions that we haven't addressed that was really the reason I wrote this piece, and it's just a way to sort of a non sequitur ending, perhaps. But is to say, no, that my approach is not to say that the extremes are wrong, but to even assume that any combination of nature and nurture doesn't get at the whole issue. This is not a nature-nurture combination issue either, that there's actually a whole third realm that we've ignored, what I call semiotic constraint. And that we've ignored it because we've had this focus on the arbitrarity of symbols. And that we've ignored it because if it's arbitrary, it either has to come from, built in, given in our brains, or that we had to create it by this conventional process, which we have not analyzed semiotically either. That's the nature-nurture dichotomy. What I tried to say is, no, that there's actually a whole third realm that's relevant, what I call semiotic constraints. And that's a whole unexplored territory. And that's my interest, is to get people to say, oh, yeah, it is an unexplored territory. Why didn't I think of that?
Cool. Well, let's see where the community takes these opportunities. Can I just thank the teams for a great chapter and for a great conversation. It was a really enjoyable hour and a half.